Good morning, everybody. So I crossed over the river. I heard one good morning. Good morning, everybody. Okay, that's better. I teach a soil fertility course, believe it or not, at 7:45 a.m. And it's like pulling teeth getting people to say good morning at that time. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm doubly honored. I knew Caro when she was a graduate student at Iowa State, and I've been at Iowa State for about 7 years. I was born in Omaha, so I kind of feel like I'm coming back home a little bit. But I'm going to talk today about some research we've done over the past 20 years from this long-term experiment pictured behind me. Let's see if I've got the clicker here. A little bit of background about me before I do that. As I mentioned, I teach a soil fertility course, but my specialties in soil fertility and soil health. I'm kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to soils. I also dabble in soil physics a little bit. You'll see some data that will support that. But I couch everything our lab does in the context of soil health. And I'm a little bit biased, but I'd rather Iowa State become the Mayo Clinic of soil health. But I'm happy to talk about it. Everybody, I hope the Midwest becomes the Mayo Clinic of soil health. So does anybody recognize, hopefully you recognize that crop on the right. Does anyone recognize the crop on the left? Sorry, I'm in a couple folks' way here. Alfalfa, yeah. So I'm going to talk about alfalfa being one crop that we no longer have in rotations. It's not as common. And I'll talk about some of the benefits we might be missing out on that. But before I do that, I want to thank a few people. Matt Liebman, he's now a retired professor emeritus. He's the one who originally established this long-term experiment I'm going to talk about. He's pictured there in the bottom right. And he's had several grad students come through his lab and postdocs that have worked on this experiment. And I'll show you how many publications and findings we've gotten from this. And I'm happy to talk more after I present our results. And also Matt Woods, the guy looking very happy there with the guitar next to the John Deere. He's the one who actually does all the stuff and makes everything happen on the ground, the farm manager. Makes the experiment happen. And then a couple of my students that collected the data. And our funders, Iowa Soybean Association just funded a new extension of this experiment that I'll explain in more detail at the end of my talk. Okay, so a little outline before we get started. Oh, wait, if I don't get to your questions today, my email is there in the bottom right, marsh@iastate.edu. And speaking of Twitter again, you can follow all the cool stuff that folks in my lab do. I really just try to get out of the way, but at soil_plant_IXNS, which is short for interactions. Okay, so I'll talk about a little about info and background of Marsden and just where we're at with diversification. I'll go over some comprehensive soil health assessment that my students have done, hopefully convincing you the benefits of diversified rotations when it comes to soil health. Then we'll take a holistic look at sustainability of the system, including the agronomics, production, and other aspects. I'm going to share with you some very new things. We haven't even started collecting data on it yet. Kind of what I've been calling Marsden 2.0 as I've taken over this long-term experiment. And then just conclude, and then happy to take some questions and discuss. Okay, I have to poke you Huskers again. As Iowa farms, so farms the nation. I think maybe you could plug Nebraska in there too. But this is a graph showing from the 1860s to today, corn and soy in the solid line that's orange, small grains, which is the dashed maroon line, and then hay, which is green. And what do you see around the 1950s or 1960s? Small grains out. Yeah, small grains are gone. Corn and soybeans, now we're at like 95% of Iowa cropland. There's many reasons for this. Some of them are political, market-based, so economics. One of my colleagues at Iowa State thinks the real reason for this is the tractor, right? Because once we got wider use of automated tractors, we don't need livestock on the farm, so you don't need the hay or the small grains as much to feed the animals. I already mentioned the other factors, but what I'm hopefully going to answer and we can discuss a little bit about is what might we be missing out on with what's called grandpa's rotation. So I'm going to pick on Will because we talked about this last night. So he was talking about his grandfather that farms in Iowa, and he misses the animals on the farm, but also at the same time kind of glad not to do them. And Will's easy to pick out because he's probably one of the tallest guys in the audience and probably the longest hair too. But I think Will's very common story to many farmers is that this was grandpa's rotation, right? There's not a lot of folks that do this anymore. And most people or most farmers in Iowa are doing corn soybean rotation. And we do corn soybean rotation very well, right? Both Nebraska and Iowa. Iowa, we do it better, but we'll save that for another day. But it has come at a cost. I don't mean to be all doom and gloom here, but this is a part of the, I think, regenerative ag movement, soil health movement. We started to recognize that we could do better. And there's something called progress bias. There are a lot of biases that humans have, but I think we're all prone to progress bias, is the act of overstating or overvaluing the positive actions while downplaying our negative ones. The positive actions, obviously, high corn, soybean productivity, and these might be some of the negative ones. So a wicked problem is an intractable problem, or a problem that's very difficult to solve, right? Soil erosion. So I was picking on you all, Iowa being #1 in corn, but Iowa is also #1 in erosion. We export, that's one of our major exports, is soils. And loss of wildlife habitat. Those of you who like to hunt or fish, this might be something you care about. We've got local, regional, and water quality issues. Greater than 50% decline in soil organic matter. This has been documented by, I'll come back to that in a second, but there's a lot of science behind that. And then some of the socioeconomics, farm consolidation, shrinking profit margins, farmer well-being being on the decline. And there are some solutions. These are not all the solutions, but there are some solutions to these that are what are sometimes called soil health promoting practices. No tillage, cover crops, diversified perennial rotations, restoring habitat of maybe unproductive landscapes. We have a pretty popular project in Iowa called the Prairie Strips Project that kind of covers that one a little bit, the loss of wildlife habitat, while also being able to produce crops. And as I said, I'm not going to talk about all these problems. I only have about 40 minutes with you all. But I do want to really hone in on this 50% decline in soil organic matter. And this is, I think, part of the crux of why our soils don't function like they used to, or they could in the future, right? And so this is an arbitrary timeline to the left, and then kind of hypothetical based on real data to the right of that 0. And it's prior to EA means Euro-American cultivation, right? So about in Iowa, where Ames is, about 15 to 17,000 years ago, the Wisconsin Glacier retreated. This is where the Des Moines lobe is, and that's our parent material, and this is a landform region in north central Iowa. That glacier started to recede. The soils, our rich productive soils, started developing over those thousands and thousands of years. There were also native folks farming for 3,000 to 4,000 years before Euro-American cultivation. And they mostly farmed in riverbeds and along streams. And these are archaeological sites where they found maize and corn. I'm not here to talk about that, but we do know that we don't have a lot of information on their agronomic impacts on the land, but we can safely say that their impact was not as great as when Euro-American cultivation began, right? And so we see this decline. This is hypothetical. It might not be kind of an exponential decline. It might be linear, but we get a loss of soil organic matter, loss of soil ecosystem services. I'll come back to what that term is. And then we're here at present day, right? With 50% of a glass that could be totally full. But I'm an optimist. I don't mean to be all doom and gloom here. I think we can improve, right? And still have productive landscapes. And so I call this a management intervention, right? So pick one of the soil health promoting practices I mentioned. There are other ones out there as well. And then we can regenerate, increase soil organic matter, and also restore some of those soil ecosystem services. And that's really what the soil health movement and regenerative agriculture is all about, right? Some of these buzzwords we've heard. And monitoring it, so as a scientist, stakeholders, carbon markets, even farmers are wanting to know their rate of improvement, right? Are we at this level? Or are we at this level? Or maybe even this level, right? This rate of increase. But soils change slowly, and sometimes you might not see any change at all. We see that with some soils in Iowa. Even this experiment I'm going to talk to you about now, it's taken a long time to see changes in soil carbon. But there are some other changes that we've observed that I'll show you in a moment. So this is, I always use this. I use this in my class. I use this when I come to extension events like these. This is a diagram from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. These are the soil functions. These, you could also call it soil ecosystem services. And soil health is really how well these are performed. And in particular, these ones that I've outlined in red that are centered around a hubcap of soil organic matter. And I'll just walk you through a few of these. So the one on the far left is the prime directive of agriculture for all you Trekkies out there. Provisioning of food, fiber, and fuel, right? That's kind of the primary purpose of agriculture. But there are other ones that are gaining traction. So carbon sequestration, right? We've all heard the buzz around carbon markets. That's just another soil ecosystem service, or what soils do to benefit humans and other life on planet Earth. Water purification, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, habitat for organisms, flood regulation. That's a real key critical one. We've had some major floods in Iowa in the Cedar Rapids area in the past several years. And the way to do that and restore some of those soil ecosystem services are quite simple. You can boil it down to 5 soil health principles that I always borrow from the NRCS. I mean, I make it seem simple, but there are 5 soil health principles: soil armor, minimize disturbance, plant diversity, continual live plant root. I'd sometimes refer to it as perenniality, and then livestock integration. And then I'm just going to list a few practices that fall under each one of these, right? Cover crops, perennial crops, residue, reduced tillage, CRP, or prairie strips, minimize disturbance, reducing tillage, lower compaction through controlled traffic farming. Now with precision guided equipment, you can really minimize disturbance or at least restrict it to certain portions of the field. Plant diversity, cover crop mixtures, crop rotations like we'll be talking about today, intercropping, CRP and prairie strips. You can see a lot of these cover more than one principle, right? Cover crops are one of the best ways to extend the duration of that living live plant root. Perennial crops, I'll show an example of a perennial crop today that we do some work on. Relay cropping, CRP and prairie strips, of course. And then livestock integration, grazing cover crops. I've seen some cattle on I-80 when I was driving west out here. I saw some on the way up here this morning as well, out in the corn stover. Seeding pastures to rotation, even adding manure is kind of an indirect form of livestock integration rather than using synthetic fertilizer or substituting some. And diversified perennial rotations covered many of these principles. Grandpa's rotation did, right? And I just highlighted which ones. Maybe the only one that is the minimized disturbance, but usually in extended rotations, tillage intensity goes down as well. Okay, so a big part of our problem is that we have soils that are bare for 50% of the year. And bear with me here, I'm trying this slide out on a few audiences, and it's kind of a strange way to think of time, but think of the year as a clock with January at noon, and then February, March, April, May, June, July, etc. And this is what our business as usual or 2-year rotation is, right? That little thin, skinny brown line is when our soils are bare most of the time, or at least don't have a living root in it. Might have some residue if you're doing reduced tillage. And this is what happens. So this is a picture, my postdoc pictured in the bottom right there. took a picture just a few weeks ago in January. He was out working on a mid-January day. And what you see in the background is a crop we call Miscanthus short. That's its genus species name. But there's a couple things I want to point out here. One, that perennial crop, it's a biomass crop, Miscanthus. It's harvested in late winter, early spring. It's still standing there. It's protecting the soil under it. It happens to be highly productive. It's holding the soil and stabilizing the soil underneath it. It's efficient with nitrogen or cycling nitrogen, but it's also catching our neighbor's soil. That's our neighbor's soil that's doing corn bean rotation, and it's just blown up against a snowbank there. And then the picture on the right is showing he tried to dig down to see how deep that layer of our neighbor's soil is on the snowbank. So there's this isn't like the pictures from the Dust Bowl where there are cars. There's a famous picture, you all can probably visualize it when I mention it, from somewhere in South Dakota, but there's an old car, a Model T or something, that's almost completely buried by soil. So this problem is still out there, even though we don't see it like we did in the Dust Bowl. But rejuvenating soil health will help prevent it, right? One way to do that is using cereal rye. So now coming back to this kind of clock here, now we've got rye kind of growing maybe in the shoulder seasons, and then dormant rye here. Can I move this? This thing's kind of getting in the way. Yeah, there we go. And there's other ways to kind of fill that skinny brown bar that we have bare soil on, right? So now we've got a corn soybean rotation, but we could do longer rotations. We can have a small grain that overwinters and goes dormant, and then we can use red clover or oat in this case, or we could do oat as a companion crop and alfalfa and cover that next year. So those 2 years below are coming in out of the clock in the next way. I know it's kind of a weird way to look at time, or at least time over a year. But that's the big problem we have. And so this was in part the reason why my colleague Matt Liebman developed this experiment. He's a weed ecologist, so he was more interested in the weed dynamics. But I've been working with him on some of the soil health aspects. And this is a Marsden agroecosystem diversification experiment. There are 3 cropping systems I'll explain in a moment. This is an aerial view. One of the benefits of this experiment, besides being long-term, it's now over 21 years, is that it has every phase of the crop rotation in it. So that's why you see more than 3 plots in each of the replicated blocks, which are those rectangles that are attached to each other. It was initiated in 2001 by Matt there in the bottom corner, now retired. And one of the reasons why I really like working on this experiment is that we work with farmers on tweaking it and presenting the results. Here's a picture of Matt talking to some farmers at a Practical Farmers of Iowa event, actually at the site in 2003, just shortly after it was established. And the ethos is a long-term investigation, or the goal, this is more of a goal, I guess, how cropping system diversification and livestock integration affects sustainability. I would add soil health to that as well. And then to conduct research that's relevant to Iowa farmers. This means talking, engaging, listening to farmers about the practices we're doing, the practices they're doing, how we can learn from each other, use farmers' input to inform the research. And this makes the research, at least to me and Matt, more meaningful and impactful. And I like to say that Marsden is probably one of the most sampled 16 acres of land in Iowa. We've had people, we've got, as I mentioned, we've had a 21-year and going crop record with crop data, with each phase of the rotation represented, 38 peer-reviewed publications from data from Marsden, and this includes entomologists, weed ecologists, economists, microbiologists, plant pathologists, food nutritionists, and crop modelers. And millions in funding over the years, as I already acknowledge the funding sources: Iowa Soybean, USDA, NSF, Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and Walton Foundation. Here's a little bit about those rotations I mentioned I'd come back to. So here's the 2-year rotation, business as usual, corn, soybean, all the nutrients are synthetic. Here's the 3-year rotation, corn, soybean, but oat, then red clover, and the majority of the nutrients come from composted cattle manure, but we supplement based on, I think you all maybe call it PSNT out here, but late spring nitrate tests. If we're deficient in the corn year, we'll add according to our local fertility guidelines. I'm not going to talk about that 3-year rotation very much. We're just going to compare the 4-year and 2-year with the rest of the talk. And that 4 year is corn, soybean, oats, and then alfalfa for about a year and a half. And that includes for up to, depending on the weather, 2 or maybe 4 or 5 even cuttings of hay. And most of the nutrients come from composted cattle manure. Okay, I'm going to take a little break, and while you all admire this close-up photo of soil, that's soil from under a prairie, lots of roots there, stable aggregates. So in 2017, this was 15 years after the establishment of the experiment, my former graduate student, now farm planner at Mad Agriculture in Colorado, and former postdoc, now assistant professor in biology at Minnesota State, they went out and sampled. So all the data you're going to see are thanks to them. This is a very complex graph. Let me walk you through it. And then I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights. So each of the colored kind of outer bars are physical, biological, and physical aspects of soil health that we measured. Some of them are abbreviated, so you can't tell what they are. But the closer the line is to the outside of it, is the more healthy the soil is. And then the area around that line is kind of the error or variance. And the thing that's striking is that the blue line, which is the 2-year rotation, almost exceeds the 4 or the 2-year in every category. And I only have time to hit a few of the highlights. So I'm going to talk about soil water under it, soil hardness. We measured with a penetrometer, soil microbial biomass. Those are very critical for many soil ecosystem services. I'll go over some earthworms, everybody's favorite charismatic megafauna in the soil. And I'll talk a little bit about nitrogen as well. We've got some cool results with the nitrogen. Okay, so first let's look at the water. So this is just in the top 6 inches of the soil. And these are 3 years of the rotation, 2017, 2018, 2019. The first 2 years, the plots were in the same crop, but then the 3rd year, the 4-year rotation went to oat alfalfa. And what we saw is that the longer rotation was wetter. And, in Iowa, to admit, we usually have a problem of too much water, especially in the spring. But for folks out here in Nebraska, especially west, I know you irrigate more, and having that water, that extra water in the soil can be very beneficial. And it's beneficial in Iowa too, later in the growing season when things are drier, say late July, August. But almost across the entire rotation, at least from these 3 years, the gravimetric water content is greater in the 4-year rotation. I'm going to come back to that because there's some new work we're doing that I'm going to highlight about that. I mentioned we measured root penetration. So this is directly related to provisioning plant growth, right? The harder your soil is, the more difficult root will be to get through it. And you usually don't get a good crop if you don't get a root through it easily. And so on the x-axis or the bottom is pressure in kilopascals. And then on the y-axis, you're looking at depth. And through that depth, so 40 centimeters, 30 centimeters is a foot. So you can see we just went slightly below a foot, but down from 0 to 30 centimeters, sorry for the metric units, down to a foot, the 4-year rotation had much lower pressure compared to the 2-year, or resistance to root growth, right? So that's a good thing. It might explain some of the yields data that I'll show you at the end here when we pull everything together. Okay, let's look at one of my favorite soil health metrics. These are microbes, microbial biomass. This is a measurement we do in our lab a lot. What we do is we take the knockout gas you see in movies, chloroform rag, throw people in the back of the trunk. We actually use that to explode microbes, extract all their guts from the soil, and then we could get how much biomass is in there. And this is showing microbial biomass over those same 3 years I showed the water, right? So, measured multiple months. So in the corn year, higher consistently as well, microbial biomass. In the soybean year, even greater differences, right? Much larger differences. Then when we go in the 4-year to oat alfalfa, still higher microbial biomass. Very consistent increase. We see this actually at the 6 to 12 inches as well. And on average, it's about 62% greater microbial biomass. And so those microbes are turning over, they're cycling nutrients to plants. They're actually involved in long-term carbon stabilization as well. I won't go into the nitty-gritty details on that, but they're very critical for soils. Another organism, these ones we could see with our naked eye, these are earthworms in the 4-year rotation compared to the 2-year. About 70% more earthworms. So my student went out there, dug little pits, and measured the earthworms abundance. So this is just how many there are per meter cubed of soil. And we saw a lot more earthworms in the 4-year rotation, as is probably no surprise. I'm going to skip this nitrogen stuff a little bit just to stay on time. I want to talk about more some of the future Marsden, but I do want to say, because I did mention microbes, more of the nitrogen, extractable nitrogen. So you all are probably most familiar with ammonium and nitrate, which are the plant available forms, but there are 2 other forms that are associated with carbon compounds, or their organic molecules, salt extractable organic nitrogen. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Haney test. So they have, in the Haney test, they have a water extractable organic carbon and water extractable organic nitrogen. That's kind of what this is. And even though the total nitrogen is not significantly greater, it's on average greater, but even more importantly, in my opinion, is there's more nitrogen in those microbe bodies and in the salt extractable organic nitrogen. If you just add up those 2 pools, it's greater than all of the extractable nitrogen in the 2-year. I think this is really feeding crops, corn and soybeans even, maybe later in the growing season. Okay, so returning to this complex graph here, I just want to go over a couple other highlights I don't have the time for. 26% reduction in bulk density, 16% increase in cation exchange capacity, kind of the size of the piggy bank for cationic nutrients, 10% increase in pH, which was a good thing, closer to neutral, 157% increase in that salt extractable carbon, that water extractable carbon from the Haney test. Now let's talk about kind of summing it up and talking about what it means. So there's a lot more nitrogen in the 4-year rotation, but what does that mean for water quality? Well, it turns out that that system is a lot more efficient with cycling nitrogen because we've got lysimeters. So lysimeters are a way we can suck water out at about 4 feet deep, and we can look at the nitrogen that's in that water. And the 4-year reduced nitrate in that at that 4 feet depth, 7 out of 9 years. That's kind of what these each of these points show. If it's a purple line, that means it decreased it. The dashed gray is the only one where it increased it. And on average, it's a 98% or 9.8% decrease in the corn years of the rotation out of the kind of 9 or 10 years we sampled the lysimeters. EPA, this is just as a reference, EPA standard for drinking water is at 10 parts per million. Just because it's at these levels in the ground, in In our soils, however, does not mean that's what ends up in the drinking water. There's a lot of things that could happen with that nitrogen before it gets to the stream. Soybeans, we saw greater reduction in nitrate with the 4-year rotation on the right, the blue there, reduced in 6 out of 9 years. So pretty consistent decrease in nitrate leaching. So there's more efficient cycling. What that tells me is there's more efficient cycling in the corn and soybean years of that 4-year rotation. Okay, let's bring it all together. Corn yields. So many of you are probably wondering what those look like. They're significantly higher, but only about 5% if you look at the 20-year record. So 203 bushels versus 192. Soybean is really where you see your benefit, 20% increase. And some of this is actually due to disease suppression. So soybean cyst nematode is suppressed with this rotation. We've had some scientists demonstrate that. If you look at the whole rotation net profitability, it's a little bit higher, 6%, but not statistically significant when you compare it on a plot by plot basis. However, synthetic fertilizer that you're reducing, and this is kind of included in the profitability, you can reduce, and especially this is based on older fertilizer prices, so that actually net increase might go up with the higher fertilizer prices, although they're coming down a little bit, but 86% decrease in synthetic fertilizer use over the 4-year rotation. Herbicide use goes down, fossil fuel energy use goes down by 65%. The environmental impact, I already mentioned that. If we look at that nitrate in the soil water, it's a 22% decrease. And some collaborators have measured soil erosion and showed that, or not measured it, but did a modeling study where they can use computer models and showed that it was decreased by 62%. So pretty overwhelming benefits of Grandpa's rotation, right? I think I just like hit you all with like a litany of all these benefits, right? And so it seems like we're missing out on a lot from Grandpa's rotation. Okay, so I'm going to pause there again. How much time do I have? Okay, 9 more minutes. Great. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some benefits that you can't add up in those tables and put in these kind of economic analyses, and that's resilience to climate change. So in Iowa, I don't know about Nebraska. I haven't looked at the stats for Nebraska, but Iowa, our springs are getting wetter and our summer precipitation is getting more variable. So we might have more droughty years and more wet years as well. And then the second thing that I hear a lot of interest from farmers about, and particularly with the carbon markets, is this idea of additionality. Has anyone heard this term additionality before? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, a few folks have. So the idea, I like to call it stacking, but the carbon markets, some of the programs will pay for past practices up to maybe 5 years. But then, you know, it seems to, some of them do not pay farmers for doing something they've already been doing, or even adding another practice if they're already doing the right thing. So we're going to test this at Marsden. I'll explain it more. We got some funding from Iowa soybean. This is going to sound crazy to you all out in Nebraska, where you're trying to water your crops, but we're actually going to drought our crops. We're going to put these rainout shelters, and this is shown corn here. And this was at Michigan State where Caro worked before she came here. So we got this idea, and this is a picture from Michigan State, but we're going to roll these same shelters out over the 4-year and the 2-year rotations in the soybean year and see if that extra water helps during a really droughty year. So we're intentionally imposing droughty year. The next research question is, what happens if we stack more soil health promoting practices? And what I'm calling Marsden 2.0. And what I mean by that, I haven't told you all this, but we use a moldboard plow up until last year in the 4-year rotation. If you look at a tillage intensity, It only gets the moldboard plow once. The 2-year rotation gets more frequent tillage with a disc, but we're doing 2 things in the future. One, we've already gone no-till, all the systems, 2-year and 4-year. And then we're also going to add cover crops in between the corn and the soybean year. We're starting with corn and soybean because we know there's not as much yield drag in between the corn and soybean. I'll explain that in a second. Okay, springs are getting wetter in Iowa. I already mentioned that. Maybe a little bit wetter in Nebraska, according to this map. This is from the National Climate Assessment. Here's data to support it. This is precipitation. The dots are the individual years. I'd look at the bars. Those are the 5-year average. And then the dark black line is the average over the 100-year average. And you can see our springs are getting wetter. So besides springs becoming wetter, as I mentioned, precipitation in the summer, which is the graph on the right, is getting more variable. So we might get a year like 93, I think that's 1993, is really wet, flood year in the Midwest. And then more years like 2012, many of you I'm sure remember, very dry year in the Midwest. And so that's part of the climate aspect. And if the 4-year rotation can add climate resilience, right? And then the second part, the stacking, as I mentioned, this is just hypothetical yield data. There's not even units on it. But let's say these are the 4-year and 2-year yields for corn. But what we're doing is now we've converted everything to no-till, and we're going to monitor the change in yield over time. There's something called yield drag with no-till, in particular in places like Iowa, that soils can be sometimes too wet. So maybe we might see the 2-year decline and the 4-year stay the same. We don't know. That's something we're going to be testing in the next few years, that hopefully Caro can invite me back and I can tell you some of the results from that. And as I mentioned, we're going to insert, so these are the 2-year, 3-year, 4-year rotation with kind of the crop phase. And we've got a split plot treatment. So we're splitting each of those plots, and we're going to insert cereal rye cover crop between the corn and soybean year to see what extra benefits we might see from stacking another practice, perenniality, on top of what we are already doing with the 4-year and 3-year rotations. Okay, to wrap things up, humans are prone to progress bias, right? Corn and soybeans, we do it really well, but it's come at a cost. Hopefully I've convinced you it's cost, and the benefit of doing things like grandpa's rotation that we might be missing out on. And so the idea is, how do we capture both the benefits and high productivity with soil health? And I think we could do it. I'm optimistic. I think we can do it. Okay, last thing I want to plug for anybody that knows soon to be finishing PhD students or postdocs looking for a job. We have a nitrogen fertility management position at Iowa State that's open for the next couple weeks. If you want to work with great folks, I'm not saying I'm one of them, but other folks at Iowa State, and work on soil health and nitrogen fertilizer recommendations beyond, email my department chair up there or talk to me about it. I could tell you more about the position. And at this, I want to end with this slide. This is a prairie strip inserted in between some glowing corn. This is one of my favorite photos of prairie strips, which is a soil health promoting practice as well. Thank you for your time, everybody. I'm happy to take some questions.
Hello? Yeah, works. Awesome.
So there were 2 or 3 particular measurements that were better in the 2-year than the 4-year. I'm just curious what those could possibly be.
Good eye. Oh, yeah. So I don't need to repeat it, right? I think you had the microphone.
Did everybody
up.
hear that?
Okay, I will repeat it then. So this gentleman up here had a keen eye, and he said there were 2 of those measurements, or 3 even, that the 2-year was actually higher. They're not significantly higher, but one of them was the CO2 burst test in the Haney. It was higher in the 2-year rather than the 4-year. Keen eye. There's another question in the back.
Okay.
In December, I was at the Big Soil Health event in Cedar Falls. there was a vendor there with biochar, and he was saying when there's a new NCRS program coming out to help Garcia putting biochar in. However, when they contacted me, they say that it's not available in Iowa because ISU, in their infinite wisdom, says our soils are so rich that we don't need it.
Oh, boy. So, yeah, I think biochar is a very good practice if you can afford it. It's right now, I think it's economically out of reach to a lot of farmers. And we actually, there's a soil chemist that I work with that he's found some of the soil organic matter we have in our soils is biochar from past fires prior to cultivation. It's so persistent, it sticks around in the soils. But biochar, those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's good at holding on to nutrients, has high cation and anion exchange, improves water holding capacity. There are many benefits to it. Problem is, we don't have a lot of trees in Iowa, and it's pretty tough to make that economically feasible right now. I hope that changes because there is a lot of promise with biochar, though. Thank you for that question. We have one up here.
First off, Iowa State graduate, agronomy, 1981. Just thought you'd like to talk to somebody friendly.
Nice, nice.
Something that has concerned me and I'm actually a seed supplier, and something that's concerned me in the past few years is I see a lot of farmers baling and selling their corn stalks. Have you done any research on the cost of that to the soil in terms of fertility and organic matter, and how that evens out for what they're getting? I think a lot of them are thinking it's free money because they go out and sell them. And I was just wondering what the cost would have to be in your soil and what the cost for they're getting for the bales.
That's a great question. Did everyone hear that? I'll repeat that one as well. So an Iowa State grad, thank you, asked about stalking or baling corn stalks or removing, and this is the same issue with removal of stover for biomass or any other purposes. And the idea is that you don't have that above ground residue re-entering the soil. So we did one study where I believe it was 12 years. We worked with the USDA ARS in Ames, and we didn't see any losses in soil organic carbon over that time period, but that changes very slowly. And I think most of carbon that cropping systems contribute is actually below ground. It's through roots and the stuff that leaks out of roots too over the growing season. Not to say residue is not important. There are other reasons that residue is important. But the major impact we saw on soils is potassium. But because there's so much potassium in the stalk, any grower that asks me about removing stover, I say watch your potassium levels. Make sure you're testing your soils for potassium, because we saw potassium depletion from that stover removal. Thanks for that question. That's a good one.
Here's the next. Same place. Right here.
Oh, right there. Okay.
Yeah,
I was
same
wondering where you were coming
Yeah,
from.
it's from the sky. All right, so 16 years in these rotations that you have your data there, and the 4-year rotation looks best with alfalfa and oats in it. So what do the farmers think? Are they adopting this? And if not, why not?
What do the growers think?
Yeah. What
Yeah.
are they doing? What are Iowa farmers? Are they putting alfalfa in these rotations?
They aren't as much as I'd like. Let's put it that way. And some of those reasons are it's outside my hands, right? A lot of it is economic and market forces. Some of it is policy, crop insurance too. It's not the same place for small grains, at least in Iowa. There are kind of many barriers, I think. Some of it's cultural too, right? You get used to corn, soybean, and that's kind of how it becomes, right? And so I'm not a sociologist or psychologist, but I do like to think about that stuff because, yeah, I mean, I want my work to be impactful and people to see the benefits and then go out and do it. But you're right, it's not being adopted as quickly as I'd like.
Okay, so in that oats and alfalfa 1 year, was any of that taken Okay, so the oats and alfalfa was planted in the spring. And then was there a crop taken off? Was there an oats crop off?
There is. The oats are harvested in July.
Okay.
And then the alfalfa goes and we
Okay.
just cut the hay a few times,
Okay.
usually.
So there is an income from the oats in that year.
There is, and that's in that profits number that I gave you.
Okay, and so then the alfalfa the following year is a cash crop, or, you have a, okay,
Yeah, we used the hay values at that time.
okay, that's
Um,
all I had.
Thank you. That was a good question. I should have clarified that in the profits numbers.
My question is about something you just mentioned briefly at the end. Between the 4-year and the 2-year treatment, they receive different tillage with the moldboard plow in the 4-year. Can you just clarify and maybe speculate those increased metrics that our first question talked about, if that could have something to do with it?
The increase, can you clarify that last part? Like the increase?
So the few metrics that were increased in the 2-year,
Yeah.
just speculate what you think that came
Oh,
from.
I see. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the question was about tillage, the fact that we'd been doing tillage up until year 20, and then maybe why the 2-year was greater with the Haney test. And I think there was one other thing. So that could be it, right? And I've often have discussed this with folks. So the moldboard plow, we sampled in the corn year, which is right after the plow happens, but we sampled three different time points from those data up there. And microbial biomass is greater. This is the thing that really puzzles us, right? So usually microbial biomass and the CO2 burst, which is a measure of activity from the Haney test, usually those things go hand in hand and we'd expect the same direction, but they're not. We have some other theories of why that might be, like maybe the microbes are actually more efficient, so they're not giving out as much CO2, even though there's more microbe bodies there. That's actually a good thing for building soil carbon. There's some papers that show that. But yeah, that's our best guess right now. Great question, though. It'll be neat to go back and resample after now that we've got everything in no-till, maybe 5 years from now or something. I need to find a good student if you know any. I'll be around most of the day. Yeah, if anybody has any further questions, or my contact info is up there.
On the alfalfa use in your 4-year study, the following year it goes back to corn, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Have you done any research or anything? Because alfalfa is a multi-year deal that you can go up to 5 years on alfalfa. Have you done anything beyond the 4-year study with alfalfa?
No, I have not. So the question was, and I know a lot of growers do 3 to 5 years because of, the short-term research and small plots. We decided just about 1.5 years of alfalfa, but many growers might do 3, even up to 5 years. I think the benefits would even be greater. One thing about alfalfa that most of you probably already know is it's one of the best nitrogen fixing crops and is deep rooted. I think that's one of the major contributors to the benefits we're seeing up here. And the more years of that, the better, if you can make that work on your farm. But no, there are some, I think maybe there are some other experiments that have looked at a little bit longer years of rotation. Maybe in Wisconsin, I think they've got a 2-year or 3-year.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Marshall, for this very informative talk. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.